let's clarify a bit what is meant by free will. We might have a brain that has certain biological tendencies towards good or bad, and we might have a biography replete with all kinds of terrible moral models and have suffered painful and harsh conditions and even abuse. And we might be in fairly coercive political and social situations and institutions. Yet we all know what doing the right thing is, and we can and ought to do the right thing no matter what. We can rise above both our nature and our nurture, and even our situation, to be good people and freely choose to act ethically. That is what we mean by free will. The choice is completely or substantially our own, our individual own. Free will, I argue in this book at some considerable length, but I'm not going to argue that today, is a cultural assumption. And it is an assumption that turns out, in all probability, to be false. I make the case that rather than serving as a description of human beings in general, free will is a particularly American and Western way of conceiving human nature. It turns out that most other cultures have no notion of free will, and they base their understandings of human moral nature on different cultural assumptions. Unfortunately, you're going to have to read the book or buy the book to get more of that history. The presupposition of free will has been embodied in our institutions, practices, and laws, and transmitted for hundreds of years by systems of education. These practices and institutions, with their implicit notion of human free will agency, still govern our lives to a great extent in the West, and especially in the United States. We can also question the validity of the assumption of free will by looking at the new brain sciences to see if it is borne out. And we can turn to explore other ideas from other cultures to open our minds to different ways of thinking about why people act ethically and why they don't. And in fact, that is what I do in part in the book. I look to the Judeo-Arabic and Arabic philosophical, Aristotelian medieval philosophical tradition in Islam, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, to develop another way of seeing why we are moral and why we're not. But first of all, I'm going to turn to some test cases. And the test cases come from perpetrators and rescuers in the Nazi Holocaust. And to determine whether the standard assumptions we hold about free will, moral agency, explain either the evil of the perpetrators, the virtue of the rescuers, or the passivity of the bystanders. So the next section is called Moral Lessons of the Holocaust. And this is a long chapter in the book, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of a snippet of it. And I'll begin with a quote from the social psychologist Philip Zimbardo, whose Stanford prison experiment you may all know something about. And that was an experiment he did in the early 1970s in the basement of the psych department in Stanford, where he put a bunch of students and tried to make a pseudo prison, and it was so successful that he had to end it in a very short time, and he himself got caught up in it. Anyway, his quote is, "Good people can be induced, seduced, initiated into behaving in evil ways that challenge our sense of the stability and consistency of individual personality, character, and morality. Thus, any deed that any human being has ever done, however horrible, is possible for any of us to do." It's pretty chilling. Does the Holocaust have something to tell us generally about moral psychology, about how ethics functions in an individual, in a group, between groups, and within hierarchies? Or are its lessons anomalous because of the extremity of the conditions in which they were played out? Was it indeed ordinary people who turned evil, or made individual evil decisions? Or were the monstrous acts committed by monstrous people, unlike ourselves in every way or in significant ways? How powerful is the situation to mold moral behavior versus how stable is character across all kinds of situations? And how powerful is the moral will to control a person's own actions and to resist the temptation to cause gratuitous suffering. There is much to learn from a detailed analysis or examinations of the Nazi Holocaust to answer these questions. Two particularly telling cases reveal how normal people turned evil during the Holocaust, and they come from an in-depth study by the psychoanalyst Robert J. Lifton of the Nazi doctors, who oversaw and put into effect the program of systematic, they were not just ancillary, they were central in putting into effect, both on the ground and in theory, the program of systematic murder in Auschwitz. And more evidence comes from an equally sobering study by historian Christopher Browning of middle-aged army reservists in the Hanover, Germany area, who were called up to active duty in order to carry out mass roundups and murders of Jews behind the lines as the German army moved eastward. In both cases, people who before the war had been engaged in work appropriate to the normal activities and ends of their organizations and professions became murderers. Lifton and Browning investigated in detail how this could happen, showing that there was little or no coercion or retaliation that could be used to explain, let alone excuse, these perpetrators. Lifton shows that biological, ideological, linguistic formulas and their institutionalization were important in the transition from the historical violence of anti-Semitic pogroms such as Kristallnacht, with which the Nazi murder of the Jews began in 1939, and the subsequent Nazi genocidal system that enlisted all the organizational structures of German society in the murder project. Routinization and bureaucratization, the dividing up of the components of the sequence of murder into discrete parts, performed by different organizational sectors, also induced an emotional tenor of false, calm, a false normality and legitimacy, and a diffusion of responsibility. The characterization of the murderers as ordinary and of the carrying out of genocidal murder as normalized functioned as part of a vast lie. For via the lulling of the anticipated feelings that murder is assumed to express, they enacted the lie that what was going on was not really murder but something else. Browning too found that psychological numbing was an important contributing factor in the organized roundup and mass shooting of Jews into mass graves by Reserve Police Battalion 101. Even today, it is possible to catch ourselves inadvertently succumbing to the Nazi language and what must be called, I think, their system of rationalization, and begin to slip into accommodation and complicity in using their term, for example, selection, for murder, for example. For that term expresses an implicit Nazi social Darwinism, that those biologically inferior are being selected out of the human gene pool, as if it were natural selection of evolution at work. The Nazi references to Jews as vermin function similarly to induce the lie that Jews were insects or pests that should be killed with an insecticide, for that is what the gas Zyklon B, used in gas chambers, in fact was. One is almost incredulous when Robert J. Lifton, who actually spoke here at Hamilton a few years ago, in any case, when Robert J. Lifton quotes a Nazi doctor as saying, quote, "I would remove a gangrenous appendix from a diseased body. The Jew is the gangrenous appendix in the body of mankind." Now we see the linguistic sleight of hand, we wonder why anyone, especially doctors who are educated people, would believe this rather absurd lie. More broadly, how do people come to hold beliefs? And under what circumstances do they adopt or refuse a belief? And who goes along and who refuses to go along? The evidence seems to suggest that it is the uncritical adoption of a particularly and generally implicit or unconscious, or not fully conscious, interpretive framework for a given situation that is at the center of perpetration when it comes to normal people, like the Nazi doctors and the middle-aged army reservists. Acceptance of the implicit social meaning and rules of a situation involves the passive acceptance of authority in defining and redefining social and institutional reality through language, and the enactment of it in playing a role. I'll just say a little bit about how individual personality came in, because I'm sure that's a question that is raised. We think about. How did individual personality come in? The members of the SS, for example, have been classified into 3 categories. The first category is those who enjoyed and identified with their positions and roles, often extreme ideologues, and gladly engaged in brutality. The second classification is those who adjusted to their roles and did their jobs, often changing their views to fit their actions. And the third is those who abhorred and were repulsed by what they were supposed to do and tried to lessen the burden on the victims, but did not otherwise protest. Philip Zimbardo and Robert J. Lifton observed exactly the same threefold categorization. In the student prison guards, Zimbardo also saw exactly that breakdown, as Lifton did in the Nazi doctors. Individual differences seem to have played a role in the way that those in each particular category approach their assigned roles and in their type of identification with those roles. But in no case did those differences result in a challenge to either the authority or the legitimacy of the system of persecution. This is how individual differences in personality weighed in. Normal people seem to be potentially followers rather than architects of evil. The meanings of situations are largely social rather than independent, individual understandings and inventions. Cognitive framing of situations, social and cultural interpretations, group interpretations, and the authoritative voicing and transmission and enactment of those interpretations are the filters through which we encounter the world and live out our experiences. They were glaring in the Holocaust because of their extremity, so they become more visible to us than in normal circumstances. But the argument is, and I've argued at length in the book, they are not different in kind, only in degree. Now for the good news. Rescue was also generally a collective affair, depending on situational interpretations and social belonging, just as much as perpetration did. The Alleners' 10-year study of rescuers of Jews, in which they interviewed more than 700 rescuers and non-rescuers who had lived in Poland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy during Nazi occupation, identifies the many groups and networks that were dedicated to aiding Jewish rescue. Nechama Tech found in her study of Polish rescuers that what they had in common was one form or another of an outsider identity, a less than full sense of belonging. Quote, being on a periphery of a community, she writes, means being less affected by the existing social controls. This is one of the crucial sources of the moral courage that enabled bystanders to intervene with saving action. The rescuers interpreted the situation in ways that defied and countered the Nazi interpretation and that of its anti-Semitic sympathizers. Many had a form of outsider identity. Being a perpetrator, a collaborator, or a rescuer depended largely on which group one was in or primarily identified with. For none of the rescuers was rescue a matter of thought-out, conscious choice. Most rescuers said explicitly, quote, they had no choice, and that it was the ordinary thing to do, unquote. Rescue was the obvious action that resulted from viewing the situation in the way that they did, and the way that those like themselves with whom they identified and with whom they acted in concert did too. I'll end the section on the Holocaust with the wonderful story, or a little snippet of the story, of the Huguenot village in southern France of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. The small, remote village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in southern France became a refuge for Jews after the fall of France to the Nazis. Its story is important because it brings together and illustrates in sharp outline the several factors that came together to produce an instance of extraordinary goodness in a time of peril. It is the quintessential example of bystander intervention and has much to teach us. The community of approximately 5,000 opened their homes, hiding Jews in their houses, farms, schools, and public institutions for months and even years, and then finally getting them over the Alps to Switzerland. They say this group of 5,000 saved around 5,000 Jews. The village of Le Chambon was home to a minority community of French Huguenots, the descendants of Calvinists who had converted to Protestantism in the 16th century and had a long history of persecution and discrimination within Catholic France. In 1934, the village hired a new pastor, André Trucmé. Trucmé was a conscientious objector and a pacifist whose views were unpopular not only in general in France, but even within the Protestant community. He and his wife Magda, an Italian, were worldly, highly educated people who found themselves relegated to this rural spot because of the marginality of their views. Trucmé founded a private boarding school, the College Lycée Sévignol International, in 1938, bringing in fellow pacifist minister Edward Theiss as director. The Trucmés had been wildly unpopular for opposing the French fight against the Nazis. And once France had fallen, they were equally unpopular for their outspoken opposition to Vichy's collaboration with the Germans. In Le Chambon, they insisted that Pétain's was a quote-unquote dishonorable, not an honorable armistice, and they viewed the Vichy regime and Pétain at its head with utter contempt. The day after France signed the armistice, the two pastors, Trucmé and Theiss, delivered a Sunday sermon to rouse the community to action. A copy of that sermon survives, and in a 1989 film on the subject called Weapons of the Spirit, a section of it read aloud in English, translated by the Trucmé's daughter, by then middle-aged, said, this is what the sermon said, or portion of it. The duty of Christians is to resist the violence that will be brought to bear on their consciences through the weapons of the Spirit. We will resist whenever our adversaries will demand we will resist whenever our adversaries will demand of us obedience contrary to the order of the gospel, and do so without fear, but also without pride and without hate, unquote. Magda Trucmé, in her interview in the film, offers this explanation for the opposition to Vichy and for the action to save Jews that she and her husband spearheaded. Quote, "If we didn't obey Pétain or believe what the Germans were saying, it's not because we were so clever. We just had different pasts. I was Italian. I'd known the rise of fascism. My husband's mother was German. We had many relatives there. We'd seen Nazism develop, so we reacted not just as Christians, but also because of our backgrounds. In a way, we were prepared, and the village was prepared by its Huguenot history," unquote. The Huguenot history was important in several respects. First, it was a history that emphasized the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And the Calvinists read themselves into the history of the Jews and identified, I think, with the persecuted Jews. One of the simple rural rescuers speaks in the film of how, and she's in her late 90s at this point, of how when speaking to other rescuers, they referred to the Jews as Old Testaments to hide from public disclosure what they were doing. One another would say, for example, "I have room for 3 Old Testaments." Second, as a minority community with a long history of discrimination and marginality, the Huguenots were skeptical of normative French authority and viewpoints. Third, they had their own alternative sources of authority and the interpretation of the situation and of the world. Finally, they had a long history of granting asylum and a system of rescue that was already in place. And of course, they were blessed with outstanding, inspirational, and courageous moral leadership. That was incredible luck. All these factors came together to produce the conditions for rescue. Some preliminary conclusions. In the case of both perpetration and bystander rescue, what has come into focus as significant causal factors are social processes of group identity and the authoritative interpretation of situations, the relation to the larger society, group attitudes to the legitimacy of the dominant authority, and the like, rather than the expected differences in individual character or in the rational free choice of some individuals to act according to moral principles or chosen virtues, and of others not to or to fail to. The amassed evidence of how normal people actually behaved in the morally crucial but also extreme situations of the Holocaust, as bystanders, as perpetrators, and surprisingly as rescuers, challenges the notion of the efficacy of free will action. People acted as group and subgroup understood and interpreted the situation, and those beliefs were contextual and social rather than individual. One thing we can look at is the whole idea of groupthink. All these tendencies point in the direction of the phenomenon called groupthink. Irving L. Janis, in the now famous 1972 book, Groupthink, documented a number of historical debacles which he argued were due to groupthink. Janis found again and again that from the historical facts, a clear and consistent recurring psychological pattern could be identified that produced cognitive distortions and corruptions through the quashing of critical thinking. Janis identified the most important group value of those that exhibited groupthink was loyalty to the group, something that we usually think of as positive, and of course has many positive aspects. Loyalty was held and enacted as the highest moral value. Janis identified 8 main symptoms of groupthink, and I'll just name them. And they come in, I think, two types, or 3 types. One is the overestimation of the group, its power and morality, and that is an illusion of vulnerability, an unquestioned belief in the group's inherent morality. The second type is closed-mindedness, collective efforts to rationalize in order to discount warnings that might lead the members to reconsider, stereotyped views of the enemy, etc. And the third is pressures toward uniformity, self-censorship of deviations from the apparent group consensus, a shared illusion of unanimity, direct pressure on any member who looked like they were going to disagree, and the emergence of self-appointed mind guards. There. Okay. While we cannot rely on people to be independent and rational merely as a feature of human nature, to which I bring lots more evidence than that, as we have falsely assumed, and think and act for themselves, nurturing pluralism and democratic structures and procedures, putting mechanisms in place that foster differences and protect minority groups with different perspectives, and shield whistleblowers are our best bet and our best hope for ethics. In addition, it seems clear from some of the work I've been citing that it is vital that different groups, ethnic and religious groups, regional and age groups in a society interact and not have isolated, protected domains that keep them from challenging each other. They also must engage in shared tasks that bring them together, rather than setting them into unremitting competition and mutual antipathy and dismissal. Little preview of the conclusions. So I'll turn now to the new brain sciences. The new brain sciences can help us understand excuse me, let me just do one, I'm going to do one tiny little paragraph before that so you know why I'm making this transition. Social psychologists Lee Ross and Richard Nisbet point out that situations are driven by subjective interpretations rather than by objective brute facts about the world. People respond to the available construals, to the existing social interpretation of situations, rather than putting together the situation for themselves independently. And that leads us to why this is so. What's going on in the brain that leads people to do this? Turning to the new brain sciences. The new brain sciences can help us understand why interpretation is so variable, why it is so self-protective, and why it is so social. In the book, I identified 3 important new ways of thinking about the brain that come together to inform both moral agency and the moral problem, how we come to be ethical, and what are the ways that our brains work that present obstacles to ethics. The first is the almost infinite possibilities of interpretation. That is, and this is due to the vastness of what neuroscientists are now discovering of neuroplasticity. The degree to which our brains are open to retraining throughout life as well as initially, even in such seemingly hardwired capacities as sight and hearing, for example, turns out to be far greater than was anticipated. There are 100 billion neurons in the human adult brain, and a neuron firing lasts about 1,000th of a second, and many fire at the same time. There are 30 billion neurons in the human cortex alone. That means that our brains have the capacity to make 1 million billion synaptic connections, and the possible neural circuits made up of these connections reaches a number impossible even to grasp. That number is 10, followed by 1,000,000 zeros. That's the source of the vast flexibility, the openness of human learning and thinking and behavior. Jaak Panksepp, the founder of affective, that's emotional neuroscience, characterizes this openness as, quote unquote, undedicated computational space. He quickly points out by this term, he does not mean that the brain is like a computer, but rather he's referring to its vast openness to transformation. Our neuroplasticity gets pinned down and the brain not only filled with content by experience and learning, but is structured and restructured by them as well. Pathways and patterns of neurons firing together become more and more etched into our brains as we repeat them. So there are periods of openness and then pruning. The implications are paradoxical. The nearly ungraspable vastness of neuroplasticity alerts us to the openness of behavior. For all practical purposes, it is infinite. And the interpretations and beliefs that drive our actions are also, for practical purposes, infinitely vast. Yet at the same time, our patterns of belief and action are stubbornly persistent. They are largely shaped by cognitive frames, as George Lakoff, the philosopher-linguist, describes in detail. Our minds are not receptacles of isolated pieces of information that we put together, but rather built of cognitive frames through which we organize and interpret our experience and the world around us. These frames are largely unconscious or implicit, as well as emotionally laden. We absorb them from the culture, familial, institutional, and historical environments we grow up in. Lakoff points out that language uses, quote, frames, prototypes, metaphors, narratives, images, and emotions in shaping our understandings or interpretations of both ourselves and our context. The second feature of the brain that I want to call attention to is what I call, in tongue-in-cheek, and with a nod to Stephen Colbert, our selfiness. Our selfiness, as I call self-interestedness, is the urge to maintain, promote, protect, and further our embodied organic selves, not only the body, but the mind and its contents. There is growing evidence that the emotions, which are self-promoting, self-protecting, protective, drive and inform our thinking and beliefs, for cognition and emotion are generally wired together. The overall tendency of our minds to avoid is for our minds to avoid what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The emotional shaping of our thinking makes our beliefs about ourselves prone to selfishness, manipulativeness, self-deception, hypocrisy, and self-justification. And we deny it all. Despite all the ways that selfiness distorts and corrupts our beliefs and action, we can nevertheless begin to discern the possibility of where a sense of moral concern and responsibility might come from. For our selfiness is mitigated by what I call our groupiness. Generally, we are selfie in a groupie kind of way. The self we further and protect is more often than not the group self. This is a third piece of the puzzle. It's why the book is called The Self Beyond Itself. And it is both good news and bad news for ethics. So this section, which is getting towards the end, is called The Self Beyond Itself, the I that is we and the we that is I. And that's a quote from Hegel, the I that is we and the we that is I. And I'll begin with a quotation from the philosopher Alvin Noe at Berkeley. Where do you stop and where does the rest of the world begin? There is no reason to suppose that the critical boundary is found in our brains or our skins. And I'll go on with a quote, a quick quote from the Cornell psychologist James Jerome Gibson. It's not what is inside the head that is important, it's what the head is inside of. The weight of neurobiological and other discoveries is pushing us toward the realization that the boundaries of the self can, and generally do, extend beyond the scope of the body. Taken together, the amassing evidence ought to begin to change where we look for ethics when we search for it. We should begin to look not inside the individual and to individual genetic endowment, as we have assumed, but rather outside in the environment, to the way individuals and contexts are co-constructed. The person and the environment must be understood together. For the self is permeable and relational, as well as self-promoting, self-protecting, and self-furthering, rather than closed, discrete, and playing out of its own internal program upon the world stage. Neurobiological body maps, for example, extend the me to include the hammer I use when I nail the picture on the wall, or the car when I'm driving. The neuroscientist of the emotions, Antonio Damasio, contends that we incorporate extended biographical and cultural aspects of the self within the neural self maps that give us the moment-by-moment feeling tone of our bodily experience, and also of our body's feeling state as a whole. Environmental situations and self-responses are paired together, he says, and amassed. Environmental situations and self-responses. So we're not just a self, we're a self in a particular context. Environmental situations and self-responses are paired together and amassed and etched into the neural self-map as self over time. Meanings and feelings are brought together as well. In this way, we discover the world within ourselves as self and self-related, and we find ourselves being built up as world-related. At the same time, we also discover ourself beyond itself and located in the world. In the context, groups, projects, institutions, we become a part of and identify with. The psychologist Timothy Wilson points out that we are often, quote-unquote, strangers to ourselves. So introspection does not give us the kind of direct access to our true selves that we think it does. Instead, we ought to look more often to context and environment to discover ourselves, our motives, and even our emotions. Neurophilosophers have begun to explore the phenomenon of distributed agency, which refers to a subject of action that is larger than the individual. The actor at times can be the group. This is possible because our neurobiological feeling of self, what feels like me, has not turned out to be confined to within the skin. So I'll say something about out-of-body experiences. What out-of-body experiences and experiments can tell us. How radically our sense of self can overshoot the boundaries of the skin has been demonstrated by Olaf Blank and Thomas Metzinger's research on out-of-body experiences. Out-of-body illusions locate the feeling of self as coming from an illusory body outside of one's own physical body. The sense of where our body is and where its feelings come from unexpectedly can be projected onto parts of the environment and felt as if coming from elsewhere. In trance-like experiences, in Buddhist meditation, there is also a weakening of the self-in-body feeling, which becomes diffused into the environment or beyond the skin. Research into this Buddhist and trance experience of loss of self is now proving to be produced by a temporary attenuation of self maps. From this, we learn that the feeling of self is a mental capacity that can be projected inward, but it also can be projected outward onto the world and onto other people and onto groups. It is a feeling of ownership, of selfiness, and it is malleable and expandable and contractible for that matter. We make parts of the world feel like self, and we fill our feeling of self with our engagements, our projects, and memberships and identifications in the world. Our self is in fact in the world and not hidden within ourselves. It is always and from the beginning made up of the relations of self and world. It is both historical and biographical, and it is also a moving target. The chemistry of the self beyond itself. Donald Pfaff of Rockefeller University shows that the feeling of self and where we draw the line between the self and other, self and world, depends upon certain neurochemicals. These chemicals that produce the self-other boundary and divide, he says, are sometimes turned off. And that when they are, we experience others as if they were ourselves. That neurochemistry that produces the feeling of self as distributed into others, he says, underlies ethics. Mirror neurons, shared action, emotion, and understanding. And this is a quote, a brief quote from Ramachandran, who also spoke here a number of years ago. Mirror neurons will do for psychology what DNA did for biology. Mirror neurons are an action, observation, execution, matching system. I could tell you about how they were discovered. It's a very cute story, but I won't do that now. Scientists invented the term mirror neurons to describe a set of brain cells that fire both when we are motivated to do an action and do it, and also when we see someone else doing that action, but are not ourselves doing it. The mirror system not only enables joint action and joint agency, but is also a form of immediate understanding of other people's interior actions, motivations, and goals. In understanding others' actions and emotions, we reproduce them inside ourselves automatically, but minus the final execution of the actual action or emotion. Thus, we understand others from the inside out. We and they are internally and subjectively joined. Evolutionary cooperation and group selection. We are social primates. Human beings are groupy to an astounding degree as well as selfie. From an evolutionary biological standpoint as well as we shall see from an adaptive systems theory standpoint, the group, not the individual, is often the significant actor. New thinking about evolution is now focusing not just on competition among individual members of a species as the driver of selective pressures, but crucially on group against group competition within species and between species. According to Martin Novak, director of the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics at Harvard, cooperation is as vital and ubiquitously operative an evolutionary principle as is competition. And my last type of evidence for the self beyond itself comes from complex adaptive systems. And I'll begin with a quote from two adaptive complex systems experts, Robbins and Aded. The mind leaks out into the world and cognitive activity is distributed across individuals and situations. This is a brave new world. Why should anyone believe it? One part of the answer lies in the promise of dynamical systems theory. Insofar as the mind is a dynamical system, It is natural to think of it as extending not just into the body, but also into the world. The result is a radical challenge to traditional ways of thinking about the mind. And I'll read you one more quote from the computer scientist Merlin Donald. When the individual makes a decision, that decision has usually been made within a wider framework of distributed cognition. And in many instances, it is fair to ask whether the decision was really made by the distributed cognitive cultural system itself, with the individual reduced to a subsidiary role. Distributed systems are able to change where in the system each component that influences a certain decision is located, unquote. The insight that a person is an open system in relation to other open systems, natural and cultural, has begun to be rigorously articulated and theoretically worked out in the developing field of systems theory. Thinking about human behavior in terms of systems changes dramatically the way we conceive agency, what it means to act, and who is doing the acting. It is the system that often, not always, makes the decision. The control in a complex adaptive system is decentralized, interestingly, and widely distributed rather than being under some central control. In addition, diversity plays a crucial role in complex adaptive systems. The hallmark of complex adaptive systems is perpetual novelty. A complex adaptive system does not settle into locked patterns, but keeps producing change. The most important, perhaps, is self-correction. Conclusion. Protecting diversity, especially by nurturing diverse groups with diverse opinions, is absolutely vital to the possibility of moral agency, for it makes available critical perspectives that foster whistleblowing, bystander intervention, and creative thinking and solutions. It is from groups, often marginal ones, with critical perspectives on those in power, and less likely to succumb to a knee-jerk loyalty to the presumed legitimacy of institutions and hierarchies and all kinds of groups, that critical perspectives can come about. Such critical and creative perspectives and the actions that follow from them turn out to be not matters of will or even of individuals in isolation. Instead, they come on the scene more often than not from the periphery rather than the centers of power and normative beliefs and practices. Moreover, it is just such diversity that enables social systems to adapt to changing environments instead of stagnating. Isolation and insularity in any group at any scale are the great protectors of social injustice and bad behavior, stifling dissent and creative and critical perspectives, often before they can even come to mind. And of course, marginal groups are just as prone to the dangers of insularity, groupthink, as are normative ones. They too need to be challenged from the inside and also from the outside. The upshot, moving on, is that sociality trumps individuality in human beings as a species, for good and for bad. It is an idiosyncrasy of the particular religio-cultural trajectory of the Latin West, which I didn't talk about, but it's in the book, that pro-social behavior, moral agency, came to be defined in terms of the individual standing beyond belonging. An alternative understanding of what it means and takes to be moral has come into view, a conception of ethics in terms of enlarging and structuring a fundamental human natural sociality. On this view, independence of mind, freedom of thought, is a difficult and heady achievement, and one accomplished only through the embrace of wider perspectives, perspectives made possible not through free acts of the resolve of the will, but instead through critical stances made available by the nurturing, protection, and institutionalization of diversity. For it is diverse social groups that can introduce alternative and critical perspectives upon ourselves and upon centers of power. A transformation in moral viewpoint toward a self embracing and integrating, broader and critical, and self-critical points of view would be revolutionary. It leads to the rediscovery of oneself as at home in and at one with larger and larger social and natural worlds. That was Spinoza's great insight. It leads us toward an ecological and universal perspective. We cannot all get there through philosophy, through a Spinozist education of desire, but all of us can be set on a new path through changes in institutional structures that foster broader diversity and the critical perspectives they offer on entrenched norms, legitimacies, and hierarchies. We can popularize ideas that support a new moral vision of freedom and joy for all individuals. Our default localism and provincialism, those are the sources of the great evil, can and ought to be socially, politically, and environmentally challenged and broadened and scientifically informed to bring out the best in us and also point the way to broader identification with others and with the natural world. Our very human survival, as well as our moral integrity, may lie in the balance. A revolutionary change in attitude also follows from the conception of moral agency that I have developed in the book. For if free will is relinquished, we come to realize that what has been, what is, what must be, must indeed be, and that what must have been could not have been otherwise. Therefore, compassion, as well as reasonable self-protection, would replace punitive moral outrage as the resulting emotion and fundamental moral emotion. So it is that bringing together understandings and insights from different disciplines is vital to disrupting the groupthink we are all prone to, and the group self-righteousness we are prone to, and which threatens not only perhaps the society and even academe through fragmentation and insularity, and therefore puts at risk our very capacity for moral action. Keeping the humanities as an engaged voice in solving human problems in joint multidisciplinary ways can help us shake us out of the narrow, deadly provincialisms that infect all kinds of thinking, including the humanities themselves. And perhaps that is the lesson for today. Thank you. And different versions.
Yeah. Have you encountered any kind of like strong reactions against the idea that we don't have free will?
Maybe people are intimidated. Sometimes people get upset, and it's one of those things that you tend to think, well, other people don't have free will, but I have free will, right? Right. And there's a psychological rule about that. Not so much. I think people are. I gave the talk most recently. Well, I guess at Brandeis. And that's why it's focused so much on bystander intervention, because they're reading the book in a course on feminist sexual ethics, and they're focused on bystander intervention. So I think part of it is, I think when you talk about the Holocaust and then think about it as group activity, on the one hand, how can we not blame them, right? I mean, that's a terrible thing. But on the other hand, what we really want to focus on is the future. How can we prevent it? Prevention, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So that was, I would say, the most challenging. And I think that was very controversial. And I think it ought to be controversial. But I do talk about responsibility in the book. And I talk about responsibility emerging from the sense of me. In other words, I make the case, and I make that we don't necessarily need free will for moral responsibility, because we have a sense of what did I do, right? Who am I? And the evidence I give is you know, we all feel sort of responsible for things that have nothing to do with free will. Have you ever, you know, people have a terrible case of acne. Boy, do you feel awful about me, right? That's me, and you feel like, oh, me, right? So I think it's that sense of me-ness. And I don't, people want to expand, what is the value in expanding one's own sense of me-ness? And I really bring up in the book the issue of the Greeks, right, and Oedipus. The whole idea that even if you didn't know, you are still responsible. And that's really, that gives you an enhanced and broader sense of agency. Because you have a sense of who you are in the world, you are facing it, and then you could deal much more broadly. Plus you have an identification with all the interactions you've had. So I think that's the only, so the sense of responsibility is something one wants for oneself, even if one also doesn't want it.
But Oedipus is an interesting case to bring up because he's the poster boy for looking for your own individuality.
Yes.
You know, for self-identity.
Yes, and there is individuality, but not of that kind. And it is a kind of state. It's kind of an achievement. And in the book I talk about that at some length. In other words, about independence of mind, which is how Spinoza, in other words, not free will, but independence of mind. But that is through having a broader and broader and broader outlook, but it's really not something that you can depend on for social, not to have social evil. Yeah.
So you talked about the weight of neurobiological evidence as pointing to like why we should look at the self beyond the self, or that notion of the self. And what I want to ask is, why appeal to a scientific theory as if it can like transcend that? A theory is created by itself, in the sense that.
Well, not all by itself.
Right. But like a scientific theory has to exist in a context as well.
Right.
Is becoming scientifically informed really? Is it superior? Is it a superior way of becoming informed about this?
It's not the only thing, but it's one of the things. In other words, we have to bring together all these things. So what is the role of scientific evidence, or of some of this evidence? The role of the evidence is you can look at, and I do, at the Latin, Christian, Augustinian conception, right? You can look at the Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, Aristotelian conception of the human person and of moral agency. And then you go, okay, we've got two theories, but we need evidence. And so we need to turn, and it's always provisional, and, which is I think what you're in a way getting at. It's always provisional to look at where the sciences are now. And of course I look at it as a non-scientist, because I'm not a scientist. But we look at the evidence and say, okay, what do we know about actually how the brain actually works? And we do the best we can. And part of the book is an entire chapter, which my students were reading this week, on some mistakes we're making in reading that evidence and where we're going with it. And I critique the two major ways that it's being used. And one of them is to look for a moral module in the brain, right here. And the other one is to say, okay, we have determinism on a material level, but we'll still have free will, which is called compatibilism. So I critique both of those and say, look, let's begin again. And that's when I begin again and choose to look at neuroplasticity, because that's very interesting, selfiness, and groupiness, and see if we can get somewhere there.
I'm really struck by your conclusion on some of the social or even, I guess, potentially political ramifications of what you're talking about.
Right.
And I'm particularly struck by the idea of preserving the heterogeneous nature of having different groups in conversation.
Right.
But one of the things that I kept on thinking about is the very nature of talking about ethics is persuasive. If we're having an ethical
Yes.
disagreement, I want to convince you of something.
Yes.
And so,
Because you have emotions.
yes,
too.
exactly. And so it seems there's a natural urge when talking about these ethical issues towards not this kind of variety of group approach, but towards trying to find an idea of convergence. So it seems to me that on the social picture and on the political picture, and then maybe I'm falsely interpreting what you're saying, that there's this need for a kind of dissonance, I guess is a good word for on the one hand, we want to preserve this idea of having different groups with different opinions talking to each other.
But we don't, right.
Yeah, but
Right,
we
and
still
challenging
want to have,
each other.
Yes, exactly. But we still want to have that challenge and that discourse. And is it just a matter of having a kind of golden mean between the two, or?
Well, we don't have
both
only
ideas?
talk.
Right.
We don't have only talk. Part of it, I mean, I think part of the answer comes from, for example, models of classrooms. That's one source. And something that people discovered in classrooms is getting people to work on a common project together. It's not only about talking. It's about joining together to do something where your interests are together in a common goal. Okay? So, you know, those things have to be institutionalized. And also when people come into that from different backgrounds, they shake it up. Right? So, and we can learn from each other while remaining ourselves. In fact, I taught a whole class. So anybody here in my ancient Jewish wisdom class? I taught an entire class today on learning from others, because we were reading the story of Jethro. And Jethro comes in, and he's sort of Moses' father, right? He's Moses' father-in-law, and they tell you he's his father-in-law maybe 25 times in, in 20 verses, right? And you learn from other people. And then, but he still goes home, and is still the priest of Midian, but Moses has learned something. So, we don't want to stop the learning process, and that's really what we're talking about here. But of course, there are emotional issues here because people want to have the beliefs that they have. Right? So they need to be shaken. So it's really, in part, a structural issue. It's not just, conversation will not do it.
Given everything you've argued, do you believe that people have a true self? Or do you think that the true self is sort of irrelevant to morality because of the group thing? What do you think?
True self.
What's the answer?
There is a true self, or there is I want to rephrase that. There is something that is being true to oneself. I'm not sure there's a true self, but there is a being true to oneself. And that has to do with looking honestly at one's own past and one's own present. And also from a Spinozistic point of view, it means trying to understand how one came to be who one is from every possible perspective. And then you find this found object, this person who's come to be, and you realize that since it was produced by the entire universe up to this point, you are but the tail wagging the dog. Right? But that's asymptotic. In other words, you never really get there. But the true self, or the being true to the self, has to do with the issue of selfiness, of embracing the facts, the factuality of your own present and past, rather than denying, rather than disavowing it.
I'm curious as to what you think about how the different groups come up with different codes of morality, if not the persuasiveness of the leader of said group, and that person's, for lack of a better term, their free will. They're asserting their morality on somebody else, on their group.
I'm sorry, how do they come up with it?
Yeah.
These are things that
What do you
most...
attribute the differences in the morality of the groups?
Well, it has to do with their histories and their present power structures and how they relate to other people in the society. I mean, take the example of Le Chambon, right? So they had a very different history. They had a history of marginalization. They had a history of being Protestants in a French Catholic country, of being from Holland. So they had a different history. They lived together, right? So they perpetuated that.
So you're talking about group agency rather than individual agency?
Well, there's individual agency too. I mean, I don't deny agency, I just deny free will agency. In other words, people are within context and internalize those contexts and externalize those contexts. So it's not as if there's no person inside doing something, it's just that it's not describable in terms of, in other words, contexts are not voluntary, they are constitutive. That's the point I'm making. So actually this came up at Brandeis. And someone did ask that question, and I said, okay, there isn't individual free will. What there is contextual will, right? So there is will, there's agency, but it's contextual agency because we are contextual. In other words, free is defined as beyond context and beyond genetic inheritance, and there ain't no such thing because there's no one left. You know. There are three things that are going on. There are three constitutive things. One is biology. One is, culture and society. But there's a third one, which I really didn't talk about, and that's situation. And present situation is very powerful. So that the evidence shows that people are not, we think that people are like honest or, other virtues, but that doesn't turn out to be the case. People are like honest in situations like this, et cetera, okay? So present situation is very, and that's part of the explanation of the Holocaust too, because you have these people who were brought up in a normal Western country, although it was fraught with anti-Semitism, but still, they went to school, they went to church, they went to Sunday school, and here they're doing something, that's unimaginable. So part of that, of course, is the history of anti-Semitism, but the other part of it is situationism, and there's a big literature on that now.
Okay, let's let the faculty in here. Steve's been trying to ask a question.
I have a question, but in order to raise this question, it's sort of been raised in other ways. I want to come back to it, but I have to restate what you've said in some ways. And you began with moral agency.
Yes.
And I'm totally sympathetic to what you're presenting, by the way, so I'm a friend
Thank
of
you.
the court. You started with moral agency. Now, what is agency? And this is really at the nut of it. And very simply, one could say agency is doing otherwise.
Or doing.
Doing otherwise.
Otherwise, okay.
Okay. Now what I'd like to say, begin with, what are the conditions of possibility for doing otherwise? And you give us three. You said situational ethics, meaning there's always a situation within which we find ourselves or thrown in order to
Well,
do it.
right.
Yes, or social belonging and marginal positioning, ultimately. And I could look at you, and I could look at me. I teach Asian art, you teach
Yeah. Right.
these religions. We're positioned in such a way as to question the dominant within our culture. So it works on us too in many
Right,
ways.
right.
But what I want to come back to here is, and you use, and then you refer to the neurobiological, and my own work in art history has turned towards a cognitive turn, not so much at the neurobiological, but a cognitive turn. So I'm very sympathetic to that. First, you talk about the conditions that are external to us, but a cognitive approach or neurological would look at the internal conditions, respond to that, and you really try to reach that. And that is really
That's
the
right.
moment. But I want to come back to this question of agency. It's still a very tricky issue because it has to do with ultimately the question of accountability.
Well, that's the question, right? Can you have accountability without that kind of, can you have it without the buck stops, I did it because I did it and there's no other explanation. That's the free will theory, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if we get away from the free will, we still have this issue of accountability, responsibility, which is the ability to respond, and the lack of response when someone should have responded. The idea of averting the gaze, turning away, and letting what happens, and as we saw in Germany elsewhere, continue to happen. But this question still nags at me, accountability ultimately, on what basis? And maybe it's not so much in ethics, but an ethos. And the way I say this is in terms of the expectations that are internalized that we have of each other, and not some external rules and laws, irrespective of context, that have to apply. That's more of an Eastern approach. I
Right,
think,
right, right.
And it's situational.
Right.
Anyway, thank you.
I cannot solve all normativity.
I know.
But I could say that, as I said to my students, I think in class today, that norms emerge, and we are normativizing beings, even if there aren't norms, the norms situated in our house, in our heads, but we do normativize, right? We do produce norms, and they are emergent from situations. And I wonder, you know, I haven't really investigated that, I haven't done that, but I wonder if they, in part, if there's some connection to early feelings of, the early affective states of when pruning, you know, that early state becomes me, right, and becomes us, and becomes our value, right, right, because we can have that about anything. I mean, we don't, you know, we Jews have it about, you know, pork, which, you know, for a non-Jew it seems like, why do you care about that? Why is it a subject of norms? But we feel an interior disgust, right? So it's a normativizing rather than norms, and I wonder if that has to do with pruning.
So I have one more question and retire.